yet. If you assume that there's a higher volatility in the market, if you assume that there's more unpredictable development going on, if you assume that the workforce has changed, people are becoming more mobile, have different preferences, if you assume this, I think strategy has become much more important these days.
Welcome to the Aperture podcast, where we're in conversation with the people thinking and doing things differently. If you like it, please subscribe and also check out our other content on aperturehub.co. For this episode, we are talking strategy. Our guest for this episode is Markus MENZ, who is Professor of Strategic Management and Vice Dean for Development of the School of Economics and Management at the University of Geneva. Markus, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
How long have you been teaching in the area of strategy?
Yeah, I've been teaching in strategy for more than 10 years now.
Okay.
I actually joined the University of Geneva in 2015. So I'm now about 4 years there. Before that, I was teaching on the faculty of the University of St. Gallen. I was teaching strategy there for 6 years. And before that, I spent a year at the Harvard Business School, did research there. And prior to that, I did a PhD at the University of St. Gallen.
Okay. I guess since you've been in the profession for 10 plus years, you, like us, have seen lots and lots of change in how strategy works. And maybe you could kick us off by just giving us some kind of definition of how you see strategy, how you would define it.
I mean, strategy in general, I would still say is very much the same than 10 years ago, at least when it comes to the, let's say, more general definition. I can give you an idea of what I understand as strategy and what I usually explain as being a strategy. Strategy is to me still, and there I refer back to, let's say, the old days of strategy, to Michael Porter and others, who said strategy is about making clear-cut choices. And I think that's still true for today. Strategy is about making choices, and it is about deciding what to do as an organization, as a firm, and what not to do. And that's the harder part of that question, actually. And to me, that's still relevant, even though nowadays it may have changed how strategy is being done, what the topics of strategy are about, and of course also who is involved in strategy these days. But the core question to me is still the same of strategy. It is about making choices and deciding where to compete, deciding how to compete, and making choices where not to be active. And this leads to what I would refer to as a fundamental trade-off in strategy, and this is the trade-off between being strategic on the one hand and being opportunistic on the other end. And we're going to discuss this probably a bit further later on, but to me that's very complicated.
And do you think that line, is that where the line has changed in strategy? Because I think the way Michael Porter defines strategy, the way you're defining strategy, where it's about choices, and in particular the bit that people forget, choosing what not to do.
Yes.
These are almost timeless concepts, right? This strategy defined like that will always be relevant. But so I guess the question is more in this sort of dichotomy between what is operational and what is really strategic. Is that where the line is changing? You know, I guess another way to express it would be, is strategy becoming more about how to compete and less about where to compete?
It's a fascinating question to me, and what is relating to this question for me is the challenge to define what kind of time horizon strategy concerns. And traditionally strategy is being defined as being concerned with the long term. And Alfred Chandler said it's about the development of the company's long-term goals. And the subsequent allocation of resources to reach those goals. I mean, this was done based on a study of industrial enterprises back in the 1960s. It is, it is something that was true back then, that strategy is concerned with the long term and what the long term means. I would say, to me, strategy is still about making choices that matter for a certain time horizon. But the question is, what kind of time horizon do you consider? And that depends very much on the context you are in. And the context has changed. And therefore, also the time horizon of strategy has changed to me.
But do you subscribe to the view, therefore, that just simply planning horizons have shortened, or do you also believe that companies can operate with more than one time horizon? I mean, the reason we ask that is because we're a big fan of this sort of zoom in, zoom out theory of, if you can plan on a horizon of, say, 5 years or 10 years when you're making very big decisions about product strategy, for example, but on a more operational basis, you're maybe trying to optimize on a sort of 9 to 12 month window. So I guess the question is, have time horizons shortened, or have they bifurcated, or duplicated, or multiplied?
I mean, referring to the first point, we do have evidence for that. The time horizons have generally shortened of strategy. So we did, for example, regular studies where we surveyed chief strategy officers of the leading 500 companies in Europe, and those senior strategists indicated to us over the past couple of years that the strategy horizons have shortened from close to 5 years to a bit more than 3 years. This was something that we could figure out in our surveys. But of course, and I come back to your second part in a minute. But of course, this very much depends on the context again, and I think a decisive factor is still in what kind of industry sector you are in. So, what is your investment horizon, for example? Are you in a software environment? Are you in an industrial environment, for example, or in a service business? So it's very much dependent on that.
Does the data that you're referring to, do you see noticeable differences depending on the sector? Like, do TMT companies have a shorter horizon than
yes, they
manufacturing
do.
companies?
Yes, they do. There is this variance across industry sectors, definitely. So it depends on the industry sector. And then the question is, and that's the second part of your question, are there different time horizons to consider? From what I can see, I would say yes, and I would say that a greater alignment or unification between operational tasks and short-term strategic or tactical decisions has become visible. On the other hand, and that refers to the longer time horizon, I still see that that there is a need for companies to have a long-term vision, or I mean, you could use vision as an analogy here for strategy, but I think that's still very decisive to decide where the company should be heading at, not just over the next 6 to 12 months, but in the long term. I mean, when you use this dichotomy, I mean, I'm of course asking myself what is with the time in between, and how to operate between those time windows. And that's a challenge that I see, is to align the two.
But I think, and I don't know if you have evidence to this effect, but it seems to us that as you say, right, keeping a very long-term time horizon, keeping strategy as a constant, the idea that the business model shouldn't change every 12 months, but the sort of execution part becomes a rolling consideration. That, and then the time horizons can be whatever you want them to be, but that's a rolling consideration versus a constant that sits above it. Yes. Because you wouldn't want things like brand strategy, business model changing every day.
No.
Yeah.
No, but that's a bit the challenging part here, is to ensure that the rolling part, the operational part, doesn't doesn't run across your long-term vision. And what I see, for example, very often in organizations is that in larger organizations is that they have two different ways of doing strategy. The one is a classic strategic planning process where they have, I don't know, a 3 to 5 year planning horizon window, or even longer than that, depending on the industry. And then they have more this, which I shouldn't say opportunistic, but which I would call maybe the more spontaneous strategy process, which builds on very specific strategic initiatives that they launch depending on the opportunities that are arising, and they adapt those initiatives relatively fast. And those two processes are usually aligned, but of course you need to ensure that they stay aligned over the course of the development of the organization.
Those sort of longer term strategic planning exercises, I think we could argue whether they're becoming obsolete, but it seems very much the case that they're still happening, at least according to your research.
Yes, at least when it comes to larger organizations, and also when I talk to startups, for example, or fast-growing businesses. What I see is that they have still this vision. I mean, it's not as explicitly formulated or articulated. I mean, they don't have necessarily a dedicated strategic planning process, but the team has a clear idea of where to go and what to focus on. And on the other hand, they usually are very good because of the scarce resources, probably. They're very good in prioritizing short-term activities. So in coming up with dedicated action plans where they prioritize, for example, the top 3 priorities over the next couple of months or so. And that's different from very large corporations where you don't have typically those very specific priorities defined at the top level.
But I guess that leads on to the question I wanted to ask you, which is, to what extent have those strategic planning exercises evolved? Because clearly, if we go back 10 or 20 years, there would have been exercises that were carried out by a small number of executives independently of the rest of the organization, and they would and the strategic objectives would have been passed top down, right? Very much as a directive, right? This is what the plan is for the next 5 years, 3 years, whatever the horizon was. Go and execute. Have you seen a shift towards a model that's closer to the startup world that you're talking about there, where more people are empowered to develop strategy, and more people are involved or there's a better connection between the people who execute the strategy and the people who formulate the strategy?
Yes, there have been significant changes, I would say, also in the mindset of top management, how to do strategy. And when you can consider a number of dimensions, for example, you can consider, first of all, why do you do strategy? This has changed. I mean, it was very often in the past, it was considered something necessary. I mean, I still remember when I consulted 10 years ago a company, a medium-sized company in Switzerland that was asking me to develop a strategy with them, but basically it was a CEO who just wanted to have a written document as a kind of a justification of what they were doing. And so this mindset, I think, has changed. Meanwhile, top management, I don't know any company that doesn't consider strategic choices as something, and strategic priorities, and are formulating them as something unnecessary. So it's the opposite. They consider it quite important. And so the question is who is doing it and why. And the who, I mean, strategy has become much more inclusive. That's what I see on average in organizations, but particularly also in organizations where in the past you wouldn't expect it from. So large industrials, for example, who do surveys of their employees, who involve employees in strategy development exercises. So it seems to me it has taken maybe 2 or 3 decades that ideas that originated from IBM, for example, how to involve people in idea generation, have finally spread across companies. And this is certainly supported by the startup movement we are seeing globally, that somehow infuses new ideas of who should be involved. And this doesn't only include employees. It also includes customers, suppliers, all kinds of stakeholders that were previously not necessarily considered in strategy exercise. I mean, strategy was something done in the boardroom previously, but not involving everyone in the organization. And then the final aspect is the how to. So the tools that you would use. And there, I mean, you would assume that there should be some more change there, but from what I see, the tools to do strategy, of course, some tools do facilitate those interactions of stakeholders, meanwhile, but they're not necessarily that modern or novel strategy tools out there. So I see that very often companies are still relying on, let's say, traditional, you could also say old-fashioned strategy tools that or were fine for a certain era of strategy, but that are not necessarily useful for today's environment.
So you've raised at least 2 points there that we want to drill down more into. The first one is really about the purpose of the strategy team, right? Because has the purpose of the strategy team changed from one that was charged with coming up with the strategy and overseeing the execution of that strategy to being one that coordinates the activities of a much larger group of stakeholders within the organization? And in answering that, it would be helpful also if you could share some of the insights from the report that you published about the consequences and determinants of strategy function size. So, are you seeing that basically in terms of how well staffed the strategy team is, for example?
Yeah, I mean to start with, you referred to the central strategy function in organizations, and I would say that not necessarily the tasks or general activities of those strategy functions have changed a lot. Of course, they include some of the more recent developments these days. For example, coordinating strategic initiatives across the organization. For example, overseeing sometimes new business development. For example, sometimes you see that internal venture capital arms of companies are under the umbrella of the strategy function. So those kind of activities have changed, but the core of their activity is still relatively similar, which includes aspects referring to strategy development and aspects referring to strategy execution. So on the development side, the basic activity has changed, I would say, from organizing a formal strategic planning process every year to a more coordinative task, as you mentioned, to coordinate between top management and middle management, or even further down in the organization, line employees, coordinating horizontally. This is something which is very frequently overlooked, horizontally between functions in the organization. So, for example, coordinating between marketing, procurement, supply chain management functions. And coordinating internally versus externally. So internal stakeholders, for example, in product management, and external stakeholders, customers that are relevant or key accounts of the organization. So this has changed more on the strategic planning side. It's oftentimes still referred to as strategic planning, but it has become quite different how it is being done. On the other hand, the execution side, is these days more concerned with strategic initiatives. It still concerns a lot of activities regarding how to execute the decision where to compete. For example, it includes decisions regarding mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, alliances that are under that umbrella. So those activities are still the same, but it has become a much more coordinative function than it was before.
On the subject of where to compete, do you still think that's as relevant a question as it used to be? Because if you subscribe to the basic notion that the world is moving much faster, and also that with technology change in particular, the clear boundaries between one industry and another industry are getting blurred. So is it really the job of the strategy team to continue to make those kinds of bets about where to play? Or is it much more about making sure that the company's fit to play? So by that we mean has an excellent product, has an excellent an optimized business model, and then has real organizational agility. Are they not the sort of competencies that are much more important than deciding, making big bets on where to play?
That's a tough question. What I see is that at least when I look at the larger corporations, they still rely very much on questions of where to compete. Of course, those concern the overall firm's business model. So if you, for example, take recent examples of large industrial conglomerates in Europe, for example, take Siemens, headquartered in Munich. What they want to become is a digital company, and they're trying to reconsider the boundaries of their business divisions in order to develop this corporate, you could say, this corporate business model. But I still think that the central strategy function is concerned and should be concerned with questions of the overall firm and not necessarily of the specific, let's say, product-specific business models, but rather the corporate business model. So why does it make sense to have the different products under one umbrella? Why does it make sense to be in certain geographic markets active? And of course, if the market boundaries are blurring, if the product boundaries are blurring, this has consequences for the decisions that they make. But they should still be concerned with those choices, because otherwise no one is in the organization. I think they are the only ones really asking those questions besides the top management, the central or group top management.
Another question on how the strategy function within an organization may or may not be changing, because clearly, as well as the speed of change accelerating, we're also living in a world where we have an abundance of information. I mean, I think the amount of data that a strategy team works with today versus 10 or 20 years ago is exponentially larger. Is that helpful? Does that lead to more precise decision making, or is it in some ways a distraction, do you think?
Well, I think it should be helpful. It should lead to better decisions. But does it do so? That's a question that where I would be a bit worried. The amount of data is there. The question is how to deal with that data, and what I also observe, and this is something that also colleagues frequently note, and I see the same when it comes to data and information technology in organizations. Very often, I mean, it's considered as something that must be done, that must be considered. But the question in the beginning should be why do we need a certain data? Why do we need a certain technology? And this is something that is not necessarily being asked. So that's one aspect, one facet here, you could say. The other facet is when I look at large organizations, multinationals. Sometimes there are very smart strategists working in those organizations who see the need for developing new technology that supports eventually how to do strategy. But the need is not shared by everyone in top management. But this is about to change. What I see now is that top management has started pushing those topics as well.
Is data helping them to make better informed decisions? Because there's so much risk involved in making these choices, the more that you can couch those choices in terms of data and demonstrate that it's a really well formulated, informed decision is great. But I guess on the flip side, the more that you rely on data, the slower the decision making comes. So is that where the trade-off is? Is it between collecting the data to make an informed decision versus continuing to make very quick decisions that are required in a fast-moving environment?
I don't think that this is necessarily a trade-off. I mean, it sounds to me like an excuse that executives probably oftentimes articulate, because what I think is required is a suitable technology, and the same applies actually when I discuss, for example, who to involve in a strategy process with company executives. What they typically say is, yeah, of course we would like to involve everyone, but we don't have the necessary resources.
Yep.
But of course you could rely on technology that facilitates this, and I think you should start thinking about what kind of technology is suitable to deal or manage this amount of data. I don't think that there can be too much data. So,
yeah, okay, because I guess that was another way of formulating the question, which is surely there's an optimal point at which, once you've reached 80% level of conviction based on all the data you have, then making a decision there is preferable to waiting for 100% of the data, because otherwise you're not first mover.
I mean, the challenge for me would be not so much about the data here, but about about making the decision. And I have the impression that many organizations rely on these days, at least, on very good data. Of course, you can always improve. I mean, but maybe they're close to the 80% already. But when it comes to the decision, the data is not necessarily considered, and
got it. So you're saying it just becomes an excuse for people who are indecisive in the first place.
Yes, it could be.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a bit worried about taking a very rational view on strategy, and I experienced, and therefore I also shifted part of my research focus towards the individuals of who actually do strategy. I experienced that this is very much. I mean, strategy is as much depending on the behavior of the individuals involved as it is on rational choices, and therefore. We should be careful to only rely on data, but that's here my experience and view that I developed over the past couple of years.
When it comes to decision making, with or without lots of data, organizations, strategy teams, CEOs are still relying on a lot of these tools and models. Are these same models and matrices still relevant? Because clearly one of the things that we've seen is in this new era of kind of networks and ubiquitous computing, that the nature of strategic advantage or competitive advantage is shifting, right, from way more from being about supply side economies of scale to being about demand side economies of scale. But most of these tools still assume, right, that a company is optimizing its strategy and optimizing its chances of success based on internal resources and the resources that it could acquire or hire, right? So do you think the strategy profession has adequately adapted its tooling for this kind of new modern world of networks and network effects?
Well, let me start with a relatively mean saying. A fool with a tool is still a fool. And I think it's not so much about the tools. The tools may facilitate certain discussions, they may visualize certain analysis, but they're certainly not the most important aspect. So that's just to start with. I do believe, however, that those tools may be valuable if applied correctly. And correctly, I mean, first of all, that you need to consider whether the underlying assumptions of those tools are still applicable or still relevant. And for example, if you take Porter's 5 forces framework, where you try to understand the competitive forces in an industry and potential and the threat of potential new entrants and what you could do about it. The underlying assumption here is that you can clearly define an industry, right? And the industry boundaries have become much more blurred these days. Yeah. So there you would see an example where it's probably difficult to apply the same tool in the same form these days. Another example is Bcg Portfolio Matrix, where you try to map your businesses, or you could say products. You could also do it with geographic markets, along two dimensions. The one is market growth and the other one is a relative competitive position. And what you try to do is to get an overview of the activities of the organization. And I think this can be still relevant if you find the right criteria to define your markets, to define your products. And for example, Google is still working with that matrix. So even a company that is considered for being at the forefront of the technology firms, one of the leading firms there is applying one of those more traditional tools. On the other hand, you're referring to the more demand-side oriented tools. I strongly believe that there need to be more novel tools. But of course, to come up with those tools requires also, at least from an academic perspective, it requires some data about the underlying assumptions about the firms or organizations that you consider. I mean, take for example Porter's Five Forces. This was developed on industrial enterprise in the 1970s, 80s, 70s. So we don't necessarily have the data yet to develop those tools. We have started doing it.
Yeah,
but,
it's more because so I think for me the Porter's framework works very well for an established business. You're relatively well established. What are the levers you could use to make this business perform better? What are the potential threats? I still think all those things are relevant as long as they're applied to an arena of activity rather than a very narrowly defined market. But I think the question is more if we believe that network effects are of much greater importance than they were historically, what strategic theory is there, for example, that tells a company you should maximize the number of users because that will trigger way more value for the ecosystem? Most models or matrices would probably want you to become as profitable as you could as quickly as possible, which would be in conflict probably with that aim of maximizing the number of users, for example.
It could be in a way. I mean, you're referring more to the tension between...
tension is what I was looking for,
The tension between exploratory activities and more... maybe exploitative activities, so efficiency versus growth, for example, and efficiency. I mean, many of those tools are definitely targeted towards improving efficiency of organizations, whereas relatively few are referring more to the growth ideas. I mean, the ANSOF matrix you mentioned refers to it. The portfolio matrix does partly.
For me, the problem with the ANSOF matrix is that, for me, it sort of implicitly assumes mass markets. This idea that you could just take a product and introduce it to another mass market. That's what's problematic about that. I think you're right. I think you've kind of redrawn the question or the reframed it about exploitation versus innovation. Well, that's because I think that takes us helpfully into the kind of like the second section that we want to talk about, which was organizational design, because there are many ways in which to frame this question of organizational design. One might be, how do you ensure consistency and control versus autonomy and agility? But I agree with you. Another one might be, how do you ensure that you get maximum exploitation, maximum efficiency at the same time as you allow the organization to continue to innovate and you don't become subject to threats from much more innovative players in your market. So with those two kind of trade-offs in mind, what are your biggest learnings in terms of organizational design?
Let me reply to your first trade-off, autonomy versus control, which is, let's say, one of the very classic trade-offs. Similar to this is also the classic distinction between differentiation and integration. So you would associate autonomy with increasing differentiation, whereas control with more coherent integration of the activities in an organization. Autonomy versus control is as you mentioned, alone a huge topic, and of course you can think about all kinds of structural or procedural solutions that aim at resolving it. I mean, for example, you could argue that you have a core business where you need to infuse more control, whereas you have more, let's say, more innovative businesses where you would like to have more autonomy and lead them separately. If I really reflect on this, I don't think that companies should necessarily strive for control. They should, based on what I see these days, they should strive for keeping people in the organization, teams in the organization, as much autonomous as possible, and infuse control only where absolutely necessary. I think that's true in a very general way. And how do you achieve this? Well, of course, if you think about an organization with hundreds of thousands of employees, a huge enterprise, it's very difficult to achieve this solely by infusing a certain formal organization structure. What you need, at least to me, are three things. Again, very general things, but as a starting point to think about it. The first one is culture. You need to have a culture that allows this autonomy, that allows employees making their choices, that allows teams or units. Think about a remote subsidiary that allows a subsidiary to take choices and without asking or getting back to headquarters.
And I guess the culture also allows for mistakes, right? Because if it's a much more experimental world we live in.
Exactly. Yeah. That would be another aspect of culture. I mean, you need to be open to those mistakes. The second aspect that it requires, and this is closely related, is the leadership. And with leadership, I mean that you have a certain leadership style in the organization, that you have a certain development of leaders in the organization, that you have certain characteristics towards leaders when you recruit people. And when you look at highly successful organizations, what they care most about, it is about how people are led. Again, I can only refer to Google here, who became quite famous for developing, based on a huge amount of data, developing guidelines how people should be managed and led in the firm. And it's just one example of leadership. And the third aspect, it is about the people in the organization. And here I mean not only who you have in the organization, but it is about how do you empower the people. I mean, you cannot provide autonomy to everyone without maybe educating or empowering the people to use this autonomy in a meaningful way. And therefore, I strongly believe in order to have an organization that functions well, that wants to benefit from autonomy, you need to invest in the people who are working with this autonomy. I experienced myself in organizations when I talked to executives, when I advised organizations or educated executives in organizations, that sometimes the people in those organizations didn't want to have more autonomy because they had some fear, they had some reluctance that this would be something valuable for them. So you need to make sure that they have the skills and the ideas how to use this autonomy.
Slightly more provocative question. Does this all need to still be organized within the structure of a firm? If we go back to a text that you probably teach undergraduates, the Ronald Coase idea of the nature of the firm, and he argues firm is necessary because of very, very high transaction costs. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it makes sense to coordinate the activities of people within a firm, because otherwise it would cost so much time, so much money each time to try to coordinate this if these people weren't under some sort of common control and common management. Is that still the case, or is that an antiquated notion?
You already provided part of the answer, right? So there are certain conditions these days in the environment that have changed compared to the times when Coase came up with his seminal ideas. And I mean, the question is, yes, it is about transaction costs. It is about should we organize activities within a hierarchy versus is the market more efficient to do so? And I think what happened in the second half of the 20th century, there was a relatively strong movement toward hierarchies, meaning firms, corporations, whereas these days you see somehow a different development. You see that markets are becoming more and more important again. Take, for example, labor markets outside of companies. Take, for example, companies that offer workforce for certain projects that, for example, allow you to recruit temporary management capabilities. So those are all examples that show you that that there has been a shift more towards markets these days. And one of the reasons why it's possible to in economic terms at least to have this shift is that the transaction costs have shifted, and it has become much easier to communicate. It has become much cheaper also to travel maybe than it used to be, and all those kind of things have changed, and the result is, and that's what we see also in our research is, the boundaries of organizations have blurred and have become less clear. And there are a number of trends associated with it. I mean, think about open innovation. I mean, this is something where you involve customers, for example, in your innovation processes. I mean, this requires that there is some communication. It involves a blurring of the boundary of the firm. Think about a temporary staff that you hire for certain priorities, peaks, for example. I mean, this is something that requires a relatively weak boundary between the organization and the market. So definitely, I think organizations have changed. Do we still see a firm here? I think yes, firms will still be relevant, but they will change. Maybe the core of such a legal entity will be relatively small in the future, and there will be a subset, a network of other legal entities surrounding this one and supporting this one. So an ecosystem, how it's referred to today.
Do you also see examples of where companies break themselves up into much more cellular structure? Maybe to make themselves more agile, maybe also to make them easier to work with a network, that dissolving themselves into smaller units.
No, it's actually a quite fascinating question. On the one hand, I mean, what you can observe these days is firms, organizations that have a size that never existed before. I mean, when you look at the largest companies these days, how huge those companies are. On the one hand, on the other hand, so you see those giant. On the other hand, you see new ways of organizing internally to make it possible to manage those giant firms. And one of the aspects is actually this modularization, you could say, or that dispersion of activities in order to benefit from unique aspects at different locations and different areas. And what we did, we studied specifically the dispersion of headquarters internationally, and we were concerned with the question of why do companies actually split up their headquarters and decide to have a dual headquarters, so 2 locations for the headquarter activities, or more than 2 locations. So we refer to this as dispersed headquarters. You could also say virtual headquarters. What we were not concerned with was the question of whether they set up regional headquarters or not, because our definition of dispersed headquarters is differently. We're not saying saying that there need to be necessarily regional headquarters, but we say that there are central functions that benefit from unique aspects in certain locations. For example, that you have your legal entity as a corporation, as a multinational based in Geneva. Then you have your maybe your finance function based in London and split it also to New York, because you want to be close to your external stakeholders, to capital markets. And you have maybe your central IT function you have spread around the world with a very large center of excellence maybe in Bangalore. So that's one way of thinking about it. And what we explored is why our companies are doing it. And we observed, for example, that already, and we relied on historical data here from colleagues, and we observed that already in the late 1990s, 50% of the companies in our sample, it was a sample that covered Germany, the Netherlands, the UK and the US, that 50% of those companies had dispersed headquarters. So more than just one location for their headquarters, even though it was referred to as a corporate headquarter. And we explored why they are doing it and found that the strategy is decisive that they have. And besides that, also the way how they interact with their businesses and functions in the organization is decisive. So whether they have a more central or a more decentral approach towards managing the functions in the organization. At the same time, we found that, or we asked ourselves, is this a good thing or not? And we discovered it's not necessarily a positive thing for companies to disperse those activities. I mean, it may pay off in the long run, but we also saw that it decreases the cost effectiveness of the headquarters. So it increases the costs that you have, because I mean it's again a trade-off. Should you co-locate activities at one location, or should you disperse activities?
And because you might lose some cluster effects, and
and you have communication costs between the various units. Think about a finance function that you split between New York and London, and that has to coordinate with the legal entity in Geneva. Then it involves quite some coordination costs here.
Just so I want to move, because we don't have long left. So I want to move on to the topic of how education itself is changing. Just one last question: what's the aspect of strategy that you'd most like to debunk, or a certain dogma that you think should be debunked?
That's a very tough question. Again, what I consider really annoying is the questioning of strategy itself.
Yeah, which always comes up. Yeah, it's like every 2 months there's is strategy dead?
Yes, exactly, and that's something that I really don't understand and don't see, because the essence of strategy, as I said in the beginning of the podcast, was it is about making choices for certain time horizon in order to be able to develop an organization, a company in a certain direction. And I think this is necessary for all organizations, and you cannot deny the importance of a good strategy. Of course, what a good strategy is then can be debated, but the existence or the need for a strategy shouldn't be debated at all.
Would you argue that strategy has become more, not less important, with everything we've talked about?
Well, certainly not less important. So to me, strategy is something that is more relevant than ever. And if you think about, I mean, if you assume, and I'm saying assume because we don't have much evidence yet, if you assume that there's a higher volatility in the market, if you assume that there's more unpredictable development going on, if you assume that the workforce has changed, people are becoming more mobile, have different preferences, if you assume this, I think strategy has become much more important these days.
I'm inclined to agree. And then, what's the best way to teach strategy? So, and I asked that, I guess, with two concepts in mind. The first one is, does it make sense to teach strategy in the abstract? Is it more important to teach the strategy in a more practical sense than it was potentially in the past? And then the second part is, does it make sense for people to go to university for 3 years to learn strategy? Or is there a way in which we can educate people faster in a way that's more liquid, more fluid, and doesn't involve them coming to a physical location every day for lectures?
That's a risky question for me because there's clearly still a disconnect between how we are currently teaching strategy and how it should be taught, ideally, in my ideal understanding at least. Referring to the first aspect of your question, I don't think that strategy should be taught in an abstract way. And I also think that this is not the case anymore at most business. Of course, you need to understand the theoretical foundations of the core concepts. It's still important to know what economies of scale are. It's still important to as it is, for example, to know what network effects are and how network economies work. But it is still relevant to understand those theoretical underpinnings. It's still relevant to know the various concepts and frameworks and tools. But it is as important to be able to apply those tools. And just to give you an example, what we are doing is we let students in the first year of their undergrads not just learn those management tools or strategy tools, but they also have to come up with business plans, with ideas for concrete businesses where they use those tools for and develop something based on the analysis, building on those tools. That's just one example. Or another example, I work with companies where we design executive education management development programs, and there we usually have a mix, a blend of some input from myself on the various tools, recent developments, as well as we have a lot of group work on concrete projects that they will be pursuing later on in their organizations. So that's something that where we incorporate the actual doing of strategy in how we teach strategy. The second aspect refers to the classroom. Still think it's necessary to have, I mean, when you consider a program on management and business administration, that 3 years are necessary. For strategy alone, I wouldn't see such a huge amount of time. What we do see at the same time is more on an executive education level is that there is increasing demand for shorter executive educations rather than the classic executive MBA or full-time MBA programs. So we do see that executives, aspiring executives, that they are looking more towards topic-oriented short-term programs like 3 to 4 day programs or regular online interventions where they can learn on specific topics. For example, think about a program that develops aspiring board members in the area of digital topics. So that would be a more specific education rather than a full-fledged executive MBA program.
So, and it was unfair of me to position that as either or, because I know in your case that there's a lot of blended classroom and yes. Online learning and so on. Online learning, is that as effective as classroom teaching in your experience?
I mean, there are pros and cons. When it comes to those two formats, I experienced myself that online learning can be quite effective, particularly as it allows participants or students to reflect more, to digest the information, the material in greater depth, as it is the case with or sometimes the case at least with in-class formats. What I also experienced is, and I did this myself a couple of times, direct interaction can be very valuable when applied in an online format, which is not as feasible in an in-class format. So there are advantages of online learning. Of course, there are also disadvantages. Students frequently mention the difficulty of having an engaging class discussion online. Of course, it is possible with today's technology, but on the other hand, it's very difficult to convey a certain spirit or atmosphere through online communication tools.
And do you believe that the institutions like yours are adapting quick enough, or do you believe you're also at risk of some sort of Clayton Christensen type disruption?
Hopefully we are. I am confident because I see some relevance of an institution like ours. If you take the University of Geneva as a whole, or the business school, the Geneva School of Economics and Management specifically, I think there are certain facets of an institution like ours that make us unique compared, for example, to a standardized online offering, or even compared to another private business school. And this is, of course, first of all, it is a stimulating environment in which we are in. I mean, it's not only about faculty educating or teaching students. It is about interactions between students. It is about interactions between students and alumni, for example. And the university serves as a facilitator of those interactions. And those are live interactions in person. And I think those are still the interactions that matter more than just the online or virtual interactions. And secondly, I think we have a dedicated faculty that is very well known globally for their rigorous research, and so we not just teach or convey knowledge, but we also create knowledge. So we try to come up with insights that are unique and at the forefront of our fields, and we try to use this knowledge also to lead our teaching. And I think this is also something that prevents us from becoming irrelevant, as some colleagues claim these days.
So I'm going to ask you the same question again, but just about academia. Is there an aspect of academia that you find really frustrating, that you would like to jettison, or some aspect of academia that you find overly formalized that you'd like to do away with? For example, the nature of academic text. What you say is very interesting, the way you say it's very inaccessible to the layperson.
That's again a very tough, but also to me very interesting question. I mean, you could also rephrase the question and ask, what would be the one thing you would like to change about your profession? And I think personally, if I think about academia in management specifically, I'm not speaking about other disciplines that I'm not that familiar with, but about management as an academic discipline. You could also sometimes include economics here, but management in general. I would say there has been an increasing divide between the academic world and the world that some refer to as the real world, the world of practice and of those to whom academics should actually contribute to. And the difficulty here is that some of my colleagues, I'm not saying all of my colleagues, but some of my colleagues clearly focus on their research, on their fundamental research, without considering its relevance. And that's to me relatively risky, because I think we are serving one purpose, and this is improving how organizations work, how organizations are being led, being managed these days. And if we are not concerned at all with the relevance of the questions, which can be very specific, tiny questions that are not necessarily important for the executives running those organizations. This is a huge risk, because there is a risk of a further disconnect between academia and the questions that are being studied, and the questions that matter for executives and managers in the real world.
And should it be easier for business people to become academics? In this field in particular, it's one where if expertise comes from being a practitioner, then it would be good to blur the lines between practitioner and educator. No?
Yes, exactly. It would be great if there would be a greater collaboration, for example, or greater interaction. Just to give you an example, I mean, I usually get my research questions that I study then from conversations with practitioners or from newspapers, articles in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or wherever. So I see certain phenomena going on, and I then think myself, okay, how can I understand those phenomena better? But I also have many colleagues who look into the academic body of literature and ask themselves, okay, how can I, and that's their starting point, how can I contribute to this academic conversation without necessarily considering that this conversation is actually something that is currently relevant for organizations. And but of course, coming back to your question, I mean, there needs to be closer collaboration for sure. Yep. There needs to be more interaction, and maybe also more diverse backgrounds of academics working on or studying those topics. The most fascinating studies that I oftentimes see from colleagues are those of colleagues who had a different career before they actually entered the academic profession. It is quite difficult to make this career change, but this is something that is clearly enriching this conversation.
Okay, just before we leave, so we're gonna tweet out the links to some of the research, some of your research that we've alluded to during the conversation. Anything in particular you'd like to highlight to our audience? Any blogs, journals, or anything that you think for those people who's super interested in strategy they might want to look into?
Yeah, I still think that that some of the more classic practitioner-oriented outlets like Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, or even the McKinsey Quarterly are still very valuable sources for getting an overview on a specific topic or a specific aspect. I would also recommend your audience to get directly in touch with academics if they're interested in certain topic areas. I mean, they see oftentimes, for example, what kind of areas of expertise an academic have on their web pages, and simply reaching out to them doesn't cost anything, and it oftentimes provides them with some valuable input. And academics are usually very open to share their insights and learnings on a specific topic. So that would be an advice that I would like to share here.
And if anybody wants to contact you, how do they do so?
Well, the topics that I'm focusing on are these days primarily corporate strategy still, topics referring to corporate headquarters, centralization, decentralization, and the organization of top management teams, boards of directors, so corporate governance questions as well. And one question that I would like to particularly highlight that I'm currently concerned with is understanding how to do strategy in a way that keeps up with the modern development, both in terms of changes in the environment, but also keeping in mind the technology, and that builds on and copes with this complexity, but on the other side, simplifies doing strategy. And if you have examples regarding that, I would be very happy to learn about them and to discuss with you how to maybe generalize and further improve those strategy processes.
And if they do, they should reach out to you through LinkedIn or your email?
Yes, I am fairly active on LinkedIn.
Okay.
And I do have an email address, markus.menz@unige.ch.
Great. Markus, thank you very much indeed. So if I were to conclude, it would be that the nature of strategy, both in the way that it's taught and the way it's executed, are changing, but strategy is more relevant than ever. So Markus, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Ben.